and makes itself known there.
Can you move the arrow? Oh, thanks.
Oh, is that good? Does that actually go on the thing? Didn't realize that was going. This is the new capital. Thank you very much. The mere existence of Canberra tells us, first of all, that the progressive, that the prairie, if you want, school of architecture around Frank Lloyd Wright addressed themselves to the full scope of architecture. They were not just designing houses in the suburbs. Their ambition did not stop with designing houses in the suburb. The second thing that it tells us is that they had the ambition to address themselves to the biggest problems in the world, namely this new capital in Australia. Not only had they the ambition to do so, a lot of second-rate architects had also had the ambition, but they had the ambition to do so in such a manner as to win the competition, win it away from Eliel Saarinen and Alfred Agash. And thirdly, something that isn't a matter of images, the reach of Chicago. Well, at least the image we see before us indicates that Chicago architecture got all the way to Australia. Well, one thing that's going to be developed, certainly in the catalog and in the exhibition as well, is that almost immediately Walter Burley Griffin, upon achieving the appointment as supervising architect of the new capital, which he did in 1914, went to Europe to gather from among the most interesting and advanced architects of Europe, particularly Otto Wagner in Vienna, their agreement to be on the jury of a second competition, the competition for the Parliament House itself. And projects were already underway for that Parliament House from Chicago Progressive Architects. We'll have one of those projects from the firm of Purcell and Elmsley in Minneapolis in the exhibition, although that second competition was cut short by the outbreak of World War I. So the amazing thing about Canberra, as I say, if you want to put it into a nutshell, is the scope of what progressive architecture claimed to address, the ambition to be a world force in architecture and achieving it, and finally the reach. This very interesting trip by the Griffins afterwards and the people who were willing to meet with them. Otto Wagner, for example, was very pleased to be part of it. We will have the correspondence, we will have parts of Otto Wagner's correspondence with Griffin. These are the sort of parentheses that are going to get one into trouble. Well, of course, there's Griffin's end of the correspondence. There's Otto Wagner's part of the correspondence. We have Otto Wagner's convolute, which was in his office when he died in 1918. The Griffin's part of the correspondence is in the Australian National Archives, which building is, in fact, right there. It's a little building, but it's right next to the old Parliament building. That's where that part of the correspondence is. Now, so the scope, ambition, and reach of progressive architecture, to use a more general word than prairie architecture, is quite different from just dotting houses around the suburbs. And I might say with a parenthesis here, there's a book about to appear from a very good scholar of Frank Lloyd Wright, Neil Levine at Harvard, which is going to talk about Frank Lloyd Wright's involvement with urbanism. It's a fabulous book. It's a very detailed book. But it wasn't just Marion Mayeny and Walter Burley Griffin who got involved. End parenthesis. We, of course, are not the holder of the Wright archives. It is now, as of a few weeks ago, Columbia University that is the holder of the Wright archives. But we have this extremely important parallel body of material for the Griffins. Part 2, introduction under those three phrases, scope, ambition, and reach. The show itself will have three major places: a beginning, a middle, and an end, around which a number of items will collect. There will be three major, I guess I should have used the word gallery instead of places. You will come in, and there will be some very large drawings presenting Canberra and the context of Canberra. So Canberra is designed in 1911. What had happened in terms of Chicago urbanism just before that? I think by now we all know, 1909, the summer of 1909, Daniel Burnham had presented his huge drawings, like this one here, for his plan of Chicago. He'd taken over a whole gallery in the Art Institute, had hung these drawings there. We will have three of those drawings in the exhibition. There were many more than those. Most of them are at the Art Institute. One of ours will be from the Art Institute. Two will be from the Chicago History Museum. These drawings then were photographed and reduced in size to produce the book that you may have seen. It's been republished more than once, The Plan of Chicago by Daniel Burnham, in which, most famously, he imagines the Illinois Central Railroad right along the lakefront, roofed over. He imagines a great development which is partly recreational, particularly down towards what today is the Adler Planetarium and what today is Navy Pier, but also is economic. There, a harbor in behind that. He develops that as this wonderful lake fill going out into the lake, and then imagines cutting Congress Street, which now, of course, is the Congress Expressway, cutting Congress Street as a great boulevard to Halsted, where he imagines a huge city hall with even a golden dome at the top of it. And going off from the city hall, which you only vaguely see here, are a series of diagonal avenues that would cut through the city there to bring the life of the city to the city hall, and furthermore, a series of half-circular boulevards that were going to cut across those diagonals at every few mile intervals. The Burnham plan included a regional plan going well out into beyond the suburbs, and including the forest preserves, which had already been laid out by, in fact, Marion Mayonnaise' first cousin, Dwight Perkins. So you walk into this first gallery, and there are three drawings that we do know, which are the drawings of the Burnham plan, which in many ways casts its shadow over the whole project. And of course, it was not Frank Lloyd Wright, but Burnham, who had first addressed themselves so decisively to transforming the city. Then, of course, a certain number of the Canberra plans. The plan itself, although unfortunately I'm showing you the rendered version, which is on display in Australia. Oop, I went forward. I can't go back. Okay, remember it. Remember it. Can I go back?
You can go back.
I can't go back. I will try whenever my hand is going towards that. Anyway, the plan, we'll see the plan again. The plan, of course, has a Capitol complex at its center, as you can see also from the photos. The central Capitol complex is the circles in this drawing, but this drawing is Purcell and Elmsley's drawing for the Parliament building. These drawings have never been seen in public before, indeed had to be restored at considerable expense, and still are not all that easy to look at. These are real live working drawings in which the two, Purcell and Elmsley, are talking to each other. Elmsley was in Chicago, Purcell was in Minneapolis, which means that we have some letters which are very interesting back and forth between them. They realized that the Parliament building itself was, as Purcell says, a wall over which the Capitol, C-A-P-I-T-O-L, the actual building of the Capitol, is seen. How about that? Whoop. There it is. Here is the Capitol. So if I could go back, this is where the white original Parliament building stands. The original Parliament building was built in despair in 1923 after all sorts of crises by the local government architect named Murdoch, and nobody thinks it's any good. A far more interesting building was being planned in 1914 by Purcell and Elmsley, although as a competition project. The Capitol is terribly important because nothing was planned there. This was going to be a gathering place, an open gathering place for the population of Australia and a place for commemoration and archives. This was just going to be a symbolic, open, democratic structure. Domical on the inside, concrete slab, stepped pyramid on the outside. We'll see in a moment. And the actual competition then was for this structure down below. I think I'm not going to say more about it for the moment because we're going to come back to it. It's an extraordinary idea of what a Parliament building should look like in 1914 because of the shape and the way it's organized. So that's the first gallery. 3 of the Burnham plan drawings, 3 Griffin drawings for the plan of Canberra, 4 of the Parliament House drawings by Purcell and Elmsley, obviously all responding back and forth. Then, on the north wall of the gallery upstairs, there will be a second group of drawings, which I certainly hope in terms of their interest and their power will draw you on and cause you to stop. And that's a very funny relationship that you have to understand in this whole situation. One set of drawings will be the plates from the famous book that Frank Lloyd Wright published in 1911, the same year that the Griffins drew up the drawings for Canberra. It was published by the wonderful art publisher in Berlin, Ernst Wasmuth. Was given a German name, Ausgeführte Bauten und Entwürfe, executed buildings and sketches by Frank Lloyd Wright. Only a small percentage of the copies were actually permitted to be for sale in Europe, although some of them were indeed circulating. For example, this man Otto Wagner had his own copy. Basically, Frank Lloyd Wright, who'd gone to Europe in 1909, carried the book back to America and managed the sale of the book, and particularly architects like the Griffins bought copies. But it famously is not a textbook, but a series of large plates, some of them on tracing papers, some of them in gold ink and things like that. Large plates in the style that had been developed in Frank Lloyd Wright's studio by Marion Mayeny. I'm using a more famous example here, the Cheney House in Oak Park. Marion particularly was skillful at the rendering of the trees and the surroundings, not to mention her indications of shades and shadows and so on. Very, very beautiful draftswoman. It is through her hand that we know Frank Lloyd Wright's work. And it was very interesting. Already in 1910, in February of 1910, there had been an exhibition of these drawings in Berlin, where a person who'd come to America and met Frank Lloyd Wright by the name of Bruno Moring, very important Berlin architect, said a few words of introduction. And strangely enough, every word that was recorded in the local journals is about the style of the drawings rather than the architecture. There is poetry in these sketches, says Bruno Moring. And Moring must have known that it was Marion Mayeny that he was talking about there. Might also say that Mies van der Rohe later in life used to remark on having seen that exhibition and been very, very impressed by it. So the first personality, of course, is Frank Lloyd Wright, but Frank Lloyd Wright already is being seen through the hand of Marion Mayoney. 1909, Frank Lloyd Wright goes to Europe abruptly with Mrs. Cheney. Whoop! If I was about to go backwards, the Cheney house, of course, was where Mrs. Cheney lived with her husband, but she ceased to live with her husband after that. Anyway, he went to Europe with Mrs. Cheney. Marion Mayoney was very angry at this. She very much took the side of Frank Lloyd Wright's wife. She then was hired by a man by the name of von Holst, who had agreed to take over Frank Lloyd Wright's practice and finish the buildings. She set up in Steinway Hall, in the Loop, a sub-office to finish the Frank Lloyd Wright work, also to take new commissions. And there she met Walter Burley Griffin, who also had his office and formerly worked for Frank Lloyd Wright. She met Griffin in Steinway Hall, and in June of 1911, they married, and one of the first things that Marion addressed herself to was doing a set of drawings of Walter Burley Griffin's houses. For example, a house that they planned to build for themselves in Winnetka. It's very hard to say how much of it is Griffin and how much of it is Marion, particularly here. We'll come back to it a bit. It's a very interesting house. It would have been just to the west of New Trier High School. If you know where it is, just above Winnetka Avenue, and you cross under the railroad, the first left, you go down to the end of that little street. I'm forgetting the name of the street. The house was to be there, but they moved to Australia before they built the house. So the second thing is that there is a group of drawings at the Block Museum, scroll format, which is a format that, in fact, Walter Burley Griffin had struck upon already in 1906 on his own, Japanese-like. And Marion rendered these. The only problem, and I just took out the slide showing it, we will see it later on, is that the black and white drawings that the Block Museum has were preparatory to their being printed on silk and then rendered very elaborately by Marion Mayoney. And the silk scrolls are in Columbia at the Avery Architectural Library there, and are in fact in very bad condition. I do have some images of the silks, but I put them later in this presentation, and now I apologize for that. We are not going to have the silks. We're going to have the black and white drawings, except for one not on silk, but on drawing cloth that is in color. Finally, and this is a little frustration of a few hours ago, because would you believe today the Northwestern University Visual Resources Department is down today. They're having a reorganization. So I'm going to have to show you a parallel drawing. Finally, of course, Marion Mayoney, until she married Walter Burley Griffin, indeed for quite some time after she married Walter Burley Griffin, was also working for Hermann von Holst. And would you believe Henry Ford walks through the door and asks for a house, and she designs him a house, and they start work on it. It looks very much like this, but this isn't it. This is the Amberg house in Grand Rapids, which she's doing at the same time. Anyway, Henry Ford does this. Henry Ford's wife doesn't really like it. It gets very difficult. Finally, von Holst, the project is stopped, and a much more ordinary architect by the name of Van Tyne finishes it with Gothic towers and so on like that. It's a shame, in Dearborn, Michigan. So to go back to where I was at the beginning, the first gallery is Burnham Plan, Canberra Plan, Parliament House. Second gallery is Frank Lloyd Wright's Ausgeführte Bauten with the drawing style that Marion Mayoney had developed. On the other side, Walter Burley Griffin's buildings in the style that Marion Mayoney had developed and pushed further, particularly in the silks. In the middle, Marion Mayoney all by herself doing the Henry Ford house in Dearborn, Michigan. Then you'll come around the central spine of the exhibition and come back south and see glaring at you from the end wall of the whole thing where it ended, which is this extraordinary drawing, together with one just like it, but looking from a slightly different angle, of the metropolis, the Großstadt, by Ludwig Hilbersheimer, for many, many years, of Chicago. But let me tell you who he is in this. 1924, he presents these drawings as a better modern city. But now there's no question of the symbolic buildings of a capitol, of a parliament house, or a city hall, as in the Burnham plan. It's a grim, factory-like metropolis in which, to give one small hint of how it works, everyone lives above their place of work. It's a vertical city. He cuts the city off at the 6th floor here. The places of work are down here with all the noise of traffic and so on down below. Then there's only pedestrian movement up above with habitations and schools, but no public buildings, no law courts, no city hall, no parliament building. On top of that, the whole thing turned out in the most mechanical, mass-produced, Ford-like way here. The city compressed together, in fact, with the countryside, which he does not show in this drawing. The countryside supposedly easily accessible beyond this very, very compressed city. But here I have to include one little detail, which I myself did not know. People may know the name Hilbersheimer because between 1938 and his death about 1970, he was the professor of urban design at the Illinois Institute of Technology. He was a Chicagoan. I personally knew him quite well back in the 1960s as a student. But before he conceived his Großstadt in the year 1924, he already was writing articles saying that the solution to the city of the future lies in Chicago. It lies in, would you believe, specifically the Monadnock building. And John Wellborn Root, Walter, how did I do that? Daniel Burnham's partner, was a genius, because in the Monadnock building, Adams and Dearborn, in the Monadnock building, he understood that all that a skyscraper was a tall rectangular solid with windows plugged in it, and it was the way you plugged the windows in it that made it architecture. Although, were I able to go back, which I am not, we could look at it. We'll see the Hilbersheimer again. But anywhere I am able to go back, you'll see the windows are not plugged in the Hilbersheimer in any particularly imaginative way. It's interesting looking at the in the Monadnock building. But Hilbersheimer is a funny person, like Marion Mayeny, in that one of the important secondary things we're going to have in the exhibition is a series of German drawings from 1903-1904, published by a man named Billink, B-I-L-L-I-N-G, who presents the idea that we should think about architecture in the broadest terms. We should think of it as part of the landscape. And who was Billink's employee and assistant at that time but Ludwig Hilbersheimer? Ludwig Hilbersheimer then goes out on his own. He was just a student in Karlsruhe. Billink was teaching in Karlsruhe. And in the late teens and early 20s, he becomes a very close friend of Mies van der Rohe, among other things, and conceives his Großstadt, this idea of the metropolis of the future. And finally, when in 1938, Mies van der Rohe is hired at the Illinois Institute of Technology, he brings Hilbersheimer here to Chicago with him as the professor of urbanism. And Lord knows in the 40s and 50s, he was one of the most important professors of urbanism in the United States. For example, doing Lafayette Park, planning with Mies van der Rohe Lafayette Park in Detroit, which now has a very good press as a modernist urban development. Well, So the third gallery, orienting the project, is the gallery with the Hilbersheimer pair of drawings on the end wall. But we do soften things. And that is that along, if we do it as we're planning right now, along I've forgotten. Are the Hilbersheimer on the end wall and the Mallet-Stevens on the side, or Mallet-Stevens is on the end wall? On the side. Okay, I'm getting it right. Is something very peculiar from almost exactly the same time, 1922. A Parisian, not a German, Parisian, actually, there I'm lying. He was Belgian. Paddle backwards. A Belgian settled in Paris by the name of Mallet-Stevens, Mallet-Stevens. He was a nephew of the painter Alfred Stevens. He was also a member of the Stockley family in Brussels. The Stockley were one of the richest and most adventurous art patrons of the time. Gustav Klimt did an entire interior for the Stockley, which Mallet-Stevens knew very well as a child growing up there. Anyway, Mallet-Stevens produces a book of plates called the Cité Moderne. This is just before the rather hellish view that Hilbersheimer presents. This is a much more pleasant, although less practical view. It's simply 32 plates of the building types that would go to make up the city of the future. Very beautifully drawn in a somewhat childish manner. He's imitating the Viennese, as in Gustav Klimt at his relative's Stockley Palace. And they're also what is called pochoir, P-O-C-H-O-I-R. And recently pochoir has come back. That is to say, it is hand-colored. But in his case, there's only one color on each plate, and they are very beautiful colors. Now, I have to remember whether I put two in. I think, yes, I did. So here's another one of these plates. At the end of my presentation, I gathered some more. They're fabulous. This is more or less orange. Years ago, Yves Klein, the Paris painter, developed a blue that only Yves Klein seemed to be able to use. Mallet-Stevens and these wonderful plates developed 4 or 5 colors that are just fabulous. Would be nice if he developed 32. He wasn't as bold as that. But they are gorgeous, these little plates. So when you come into the final room, I'm afraid the terrifying Hilbersheimer, who, as one who knew him, he was a short little guy who always dressed very formally, Homburg hat and gray, and was the sweetest person on the face of this earth. He was a very, very kind man. You would never guess it from those drawings, and he himself, at the end of his life, said, "I don't know what made me do that." Okay, so the first thing, which by now you don't need me to say again, is the show shows the ambition, the reach, and the scope. I've been saying it in the other order: the scope, the ambition, and reach of Chicago architecture. The show itself has, if you want, 3 accent points. The first gallery with Burnham, Griffin, and the Parliament Building by Purcell and Elmsley. The middle gallery with the house drawings by Frank Lloyd Wright, by Marion Mayony, and by Walter Burley Griffin, but all 3 from the hand of Marion Mayony. Only the middle, the Henry Ford house, her design as well as her drawings. The last gallery has Mallet-Stevens looking across at Hilbersheimer, Stevens still in the lyrical style of the Griffins, and Hilbersheimer sinking into the new style of the 1920s and 30s and high modernism. Third concept, if you want, and this is it for basic concepts, although there's a lot more that falls under these headings, and that is Canberra a capital city? That is to say, a kind of functioning city? Is it a utopia? Remember that Capitol, C-A-P-I-T-O-L, that building that the Griffins intended at the center, which was quite unique, and the program for the building never mentions, that is to say, a gathering place for the population of Australia and a place of memory. Is it a spectacle? I use this image here that everybody does because there's a hill in the middle of this valley where Canberra sits. And I think the thing went off again. No? There was a sudden change in the resonance. Okay, you can hear me. Is it a spectacle? Because you're on this thing called Mount Ainslie, A-I-N-S-L-I-E. You drive up to it. It's big, tall, conical hill. And it's right on axis with the Capitol, whether it's the new one or the old one there. The city is laid out around that. Is it a spectacle? Is it as glorious to look at, because it was meant to be glorious to look at? And Griffin himself, in a quotation that we're going to have on the wall when you go in, describes it exactly as that. And I realize it didn't bring the quotation, but we'll let it speak for itself. Or finally, is it a drawing? Is Canberra really, like so many city plans, like Burnham's plan for Chicago, in the end, nothing but a drawing and only achieving completion in little bits, just the way the Burnham plan only achieved completion in little bits? And I hope to tell you a little bit about that last, because, of course, what transforms a whole city from a drawing into a city is an awful lot of effort and an awful lot of politics and a long and hard story. Which reminds me, I had a bibliography that I gave Corinne. Have we? No?
We can send that out. Yes.
Okay, there is a bibliography. I think of that because there's a wonderful book by the man who for decades was in charge of seeing Canberra through, named Paul Reed, and he did see it through. That's why it's here. Paul Reed, he wrote a wonderful book about, it's called Canberra After Griffin, and it's how the thing actually changed from being a drawing into a city. Here is the view from Mount Ainslie in the original competition drawings by Marion Mayany, colored. These, I'm afraid, are in the National Archives in Australia. I wanted dearly to bring them here to Chicago. Someday they must visit Chicago, but they haven't yet, because they're celebrating the 100th anniversary of Canberra right now in Australia, and they're on the wall in the National Archives, which I showed you some time ago, is right next to the Parliament building in the center of the city. What we can show you are the outlawing drawings, which Marion Mayany used to draw the final rendered drawings. Those are at the Art Institute. Those will be with us. This particular sheet from that set is the one looking across the lagoons, across the valley there, to the Capitol buildings. The Parliament building is this thing down here, and this is the Capitol here. Horizontal concrete slabs, a dome inside, and openings on each of its sides looking down from this hill, called Capitol Hill, would you believe, towards the rest of the city. Certainly, the simplest possible way of talking about Canberra is to say that it's a capital city. It has at its core a Capitol. It has around that Capitol different government buildings, starting with the Parliament there, and then bureaucratic buildings beyond that. It even has a kind of port for boats chugging up and down the lagoons in the center. You might say, how are there going to be lagoons? They were going to dam up a river that went through, or a small stream called the Molonglo, and by damming it up, have it flood part of the lower part of the valley, which of course today is what you see. Here is the plan as they proposed it, with the Capitol there. the government buildings there. The Molonglo, here's what the Molonglo is all by itself, but once dammed up there, it turns into these various lagoons. Mount Ainslie over here, neatly on axis with the Capitol complex. And then a series of different parts to the city. This was going to be the commercial part, and it still is. There are more and more skyscrapers there. This was going to be an industrial portion of the city with a railroad coming in. In fact, Sydney is off in that direction. So if you're going to Sydney, you go down Northumberland Avenue in that direction. He calls it the municipal center. It's an interesting thing. First of all, of course, Australia, like England, has a state church. So the cathedral is going to be there. It's not there. Most American cities don't have a cathedral as one of their central features. Of course, there's a city hall, and there are other city buildings are going to be there. Then this was going to be for the general public. A beautiful big park with art museum, theaters, and so on like that, and then what he calls a casino there. Unfortunately, the casino, after World War I, became a war monument. The thing that seemed to warrant the greatest, quite rightly, the greatest commemoration was that, rather than pleasure of a casino. And then suburbs out here, each one growing outward from a center, theoretically starting as little nodes and getting larger, and extending out to the countryside as they went. Lord knows, the drawings by Purcell and Elmsley would make you think that what we're dealing with is the problem of a capital. They're very interesting, as I already indicated, because Purcell and Elmsley were very aware that they were a wall over which you look at the Capitol itself. There's a central hallway here, but then from here to here, there really isn't anything. They try to push the building away with a Senate and a House of Representatives at the far ends, and their offices turned at right angles so that the building doesn't get in the way of the main axis going towards Walter Burley Griffin's Capitol. That is to say, Purcell is trying to be sympathetic with Griffin. I might say the correspondence between Griffin and Purcell exists, and Griffin is being very, very legalistic. He's saying, I can't tell you anything. I'm glad you're working on it. But, you know, I'm not going to give you any preference to anybody else. But Purcell, on his own, is trying to play into the project itself and take it one step further. Here is a finished plan that we will have. This is the other side. There's the equivalent of well, it's called the Senate there, with the secondary committee rooms and offices around it, then a few offices here, and a big garden before you have the domed arch, and in fact, the National Library behind it out there. This you will find very frustrating, of course. This is the most important drawing and the one you can't see. You will have to simply walk up to it and look. It's, of course, the front and the back of the building. And it's a very interesting front, and it's a very interesting back. And I don't think I can tell you much, but I'll tell you there are no classical columns, there are no pediments. There's nothing of the sort that you would have expected from a capital. There is an effort by Purcell and Elmsley to imagine, in terms of Frank Lloyd Wright, what a national capital might look like. We are not going to have, unfortunately, the comparative things that one would like to see, namely the second prize project by Eliel Saarinen, who similarly had the idea of damming up the Molonglo River a bit and putting the Capitol building here, but had a very different idea of how you lay out the streets around it. He also had a very different idea of how it would be built up. Canberra had no private ownership within the city, which was like Washington, D.C., a whole capital district. Furthermore, it legislated that single-family homes should be used in the the built-up areas. So the views I've shown you of Canberra with all the nice trees and so on are the trees between lots and lots of little 1- and 2-story houses. Saarinen, coming from Northern Europe, imagined that something like Paris would actually have come into being with these apartment buildings throughout. Alfred Agache, we will not have his, I fear, drawings either, which are a good deal more chaotic than Saarinen. I must say that one really admires how Saarinen's holds together. Agache has delightful things like an airport, one of the first airports that I know of in a urban design, large railroad yards out here, but the Capitol complex somewhat isolated amidst all of this, and some interesting but rather strange residential areas imagined going out to these sides. Once again, Monsieur Agache, who is a futurist, if nothing else, imagines it being seen from a dirigible bubbling along above the city. Okay, is it a capital, a utopia, a spectacle, or a bunch of drawings? There was nothing new about doing capitals in the year 1911. In Britain, right after 1900, 1903, the Great Mall from the front of Buckingham Palace, which was rebuilt at that time, was stretched out to Trafalgar Square and the Admiralty Arch. At the same time, in South Africa, the Capitol complex in Pretoria was being designed and built after the Boer War. And in 1911, 12, 13, in New Delhi, or the old Delhi was getting an addition of New Delhi with a series of quite classical buildings built up by the famous architect Edwin Lutyens there. In America, of course, Daniel Burnham, 1901, 1902, designed, or I shouldn't say designed, went back to L'Enfant's idea of Washington and completed it. At that point, Washington turned into a marshy swamp down here. That's why they called it Foggy Bottom. He had the idea of filling this area of the Potomac, extending the axis from the Capitol building to the Washington Monument out to a new monument, which became the Lincoln Memorial, having a monument down this way from the White House to what in this case was going to be the Theodore Roosevelt Monument, but turned out to be the Jefferson Memorial, and bring this kind of great scale and capital entourage that was coming to be accepted around the world as a signature of a Capitol building. In 1911 to 1912, 1913, a man in Rome by the name of Hendrik Andersen, Andersen, Norwegian-American, spent a huge amount of money to produce the drawings for and a book publishing, more than one book publishing, a capital of the world, which he designed, patronizing an architect, a young French architect named Hébrard, Hebrard, Ernest Hébrard, where there would be the Olympic complex for the Olympic Games there, a scientific research complex here, a communication center with a tower. Uh-oh, I can't go back. You'll see the tower in a moment. The tower there with scientists, spaces for scientific conferences around it, and then a modern city with a subway system and a central heating system and so on outside of that. This project was taken seriously. Here's our great tower, our great skyscraper of world communication that was to rise up from the middle of it. He, in one of his publications, imagines this plan dropped down at different sites all over the world. Asbury Park on the shore of New Jersey is one of the sites. Bern, Switzerland is another. Constantinople, he shows where it would fit. Near London, near Paris, near Brussels, and so on like that. But this certainly is the idea of a capital carried to its ultimate degree. And one of the things that's always worrisome about Burnham's famous plan for Chicago is it looks like it is a capital city with the extraordinarily large city hall there and its gold dome at the center. And there was a certain amount of agitation at that time to move the capital from Washington to the center of the country to Chicago, which is gently suggested here. Here is the City Hall complex. Even in the days of elephantiasis and city administration, one finds it hard to believe that that was a city hall rather than a national capital. Okay, so it's one of a number of national capitals that merged right at this time, and it certainly fits rather well with them. However, there is an obvious inflection in the whole thing, which seems utopian, and which the Australians themselves often cite as utopian. In fact, right this year, the 100th anniversary, the government has made a very interesting video, a movie about it, in which it's overtly utopian. The government itself being a very socially responsible one under the woman Prime Minister, Julia Gillard. It's quite an interesting, a bit of a tear-jerking video. But these wonderful social reformers from Chicago came and gave us this extraordinary utopia. Well, what's utopian about it? First of all, the very division of the city into parts. That's something that the Griffins got from a major utopian thrust that was in process at that very time. Came to be called the Garden City Movement. It was initiated by a man by the name of Ebenezer Howard, who in 1898 published a book called Tomorrow, A Peaceful Path to Change, in which he said, the world is on the edge of revolution. We need to divide the world's resources more evenly. We need to give the mass of the population access to the countryside. Let us imagine the whole world with a texture of cities like this, with a small central node of 50,000 people, and then connected by local railroad lines to a series of outer citylets here, each one of them belted in by a small railroad line and a group of local factories. In the detailed drawing, he imagines a bicycle works and a jam factory. Obviously, jam would be grown in the countryside that would come around the outside here. And then, would you believe, an iron and glass building in the center of each node for the whole population to get together and enjoy each other, like the Capitol in Canberra. And it has been observed that Canberra is a version of this Garden City dispersal, where the different suburbs are dotted across the landscape, just the way they are in the in Ebenezer Howard's Garden City. And the Garden City, there was a Garden City Association established, a first Garden City right in 1903. Letchworth was constructed outside of London. Second was done in the 1920s, Wayland. And in 1946, the Newtown Act in Britain drew a line around London past which the city could not expand, and the Green Belt was established out there. In the case of Canberra, because I can't go back, I can't show it to you, the Griffins got a law forbidding construction on the hills around the city. And if we were going to go back to the images of Canberra I've shown you, you'll see there's no construction up in the hills. The city is only permitted down in the valleys, and you can walk out into the hills very easily from any particular direction. All of this as an application of the Garden City concept. It's an old concept that went back to the 18 teens, 20s, 30s, and 40s. This is an image from 1851 by a man named Frerson, who imagines the wicked city of Manchester, the new factory cities of Britain being gotten rid of, and little factory towns with the factory itself out in the countryside, linked together by railroads. The workers living in decent habitations here with a garden on the inside, little kitchen gardens on the outside, a communal dining room, and even a steam engine to provide power and electricity for the and heat for the whole establishment. Ebenezer Howard in 1902 was only carrying on an idea that was almost 100 years old by the time he got to it. But, of course, there is that Capitol in the center. We've seen this image before. It will be one of the images right at the beginning of the exhibition. And what's interesting about that Capitol is that it also has a bit of a history, and it's a strange history, and I have to be very careful about this. The Capitol was designed by the Griffins in 1911. At that time, there was a utopian, his political party was called the Radical Party, utopian politician who was mayor of Lyon in France. Lyon, like Manchester, was a working class city, and a city where plans for a better community were being discussed and implemented. This mayor, his name was Edouard Herriot, Herriot. How do you say it? Partnered with a young architect by the name of Tony Garnier, Garnier. Garnier came from Lyon, was the son of a weaver, was a very brilliant architect, went to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, won the Grand Prix de Rome, the premier prize, went to Rome for 5 years, but when he was in Rome, spent his time designing what he called une cité industrielle, an industrial community. Upon finishing, he was brought back to Lyon by Herriot. He was made city architect of Lyon by Herriot. But while he was working as city architect, he was doing drawings for his Cité Industrielle, and in 1917, during World War I, produced an extraordinary portfolio of drawings, some of which will be in the exhibition, including a city hall here. A city hall consisting of a series of horizontal concrete slabs, completely open on all sides. The city also has no prison, no police station, and I'm afraid also no church. It's a completely utopian community where everybody gets along with everybody else. Also, there's no land ownership. We'll see that in a moment. So here's another view of this central building. And in fact, when the Griffins visited Paris in 1914, Edouard Herriot came up to Paris and tried to meet them, but failed. And he then asked them, through intermediaries, to send their plans for Canberra to Lyon to be exhibited. In fact, the exhibition was arranged by Tony Garnier for an exhibition in the summer of 1914 called the Exposition Internationale Urbaine, the International Urban Exhibit or Exposition, so that the Griffins' drawings were in Lyon on the wall from the hand of Tony Garnier 3 years before Tony Garnier then publishes his drawings here. Probably Garnier had already established his own ideas. It would be very hard to imagine that he hadn't. But there is a peculiar combination of the two, particularly around that idea of the cast concrete central meeting place there. Here's a more distant view of it. Tony Garnier imagines it on a hillside up into the mountains behind to the west of Lyon here, and the whole place powered by water power, nature itself providing the energy that the city needs to use. No land ownership, as in Canberra. so that the little concrete houses that make up Tony Garnier's world are going to have paths around where the general public gather and play and talk to each other and hang out. The funny thing is that the Griffin's architecture isn't that different. This is the Mess House on Pine Street in Winnetka, right there to be gone and seen, which they designed in 1912, which is in its great simplicity and its square concrete construction, looking surely entirely by chance very, very much like Tony Garnier's conceptions of that same time. Not to mention looking rather like Mallet-Stevens' ideas of that time. And Mallet-Stevens started the drawings on his 1922, or for his 1922 Cité Moderne in 1917. It is imagined that it was Tony Garnier's Cité Industrielle that moved Mallet-Stevens to do what he did. And what you see is, of course, things are starting to intertwine in almost hysterically frustrating directions. But the fascinating thing is such connections like Herriot and Griffin are easily documented. All the documents are in the Lyon city archives, and this was really going on. Now, the story, of course, gets more complex because Mallet-Stevens, a few years after his Cité Moderne, gets a chance to design a whole street in Paris. The street's name is, would you believe, the Rue Mallet-Stevens. But here it is. Now, what's happened is that it's gotten simpler. It's gotten a bit more like the modern architecture that we know from Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe, but still it's this idea of trying to put together a community, and a particularly picturesque community, elaborate sets of balconies and interconnecting staircases. So while on the one hand it looks very modern, it doesn't have the harshness, for example, of Hilbersheimer, and it's by no means the kind of mass-produced modernism that Hilbersheimer was putting forward. Here's another view of the Rue Mallet-Stevens. At this same time, too, to go back to where I started from, that was this a utopia. When Griffin, finally in frustration at government obfuscation, resigned in 1921, he was already working on creating an ideal suburb in Sydney called Castle Crag. And he developed a new mass-produced cheap building method out of concrete block to produce these houses. He managed to buy, well, he didn't manage to buy. He created a company. The company bought a very, very beautiful site on the Middle Harbor and then started selling lots to friends and supporters. They employed him as the architect. He also had strict zoning regulations that prevented, say, peaked roofs and red brick. He wanted the buildings to be pushed down into the rocky landscape there, and a very beautiful suburb resulted where they lived until 1935. Okay, now, how much longer do you want me to go?
How much more do you have?
I could jump a bit. How about 10 more minutes? I could go on about this issue of whether or not it's a utopia, but let me not. So we're going to jump over the comparisons with Frank Lloyd Wright. We're going to mention one single thing, which is in 1915, the famous Chicago architect Howard Van Doren Shaw decides to have an interesting set of lectures at the Art Institute using the money from an endowment called the Scammond Fund. Scammond Fund then every year paid for 6 public lectures. Usually they'd have 1 lecturer. Said no. Going to be on architecture, we're going to get 3. He gets a classicist, but not Daniel Burnham, a classicist from outside of town. Daniel Burnham was dead. He gets Thomas Hastings, who'd recently finished the New York Public Library. A Gothicist, he gets the famous Ralph Adams Cram to talk about arts and crafts and Gothic. And then he gets a third person. Now, Chicago was where you had oomph. You had modern architecture, whatever you want to call it. You had prairie architecture. You had Frank Lloyd Wright architecture. You had progressive architecture. He can't get a Chicagoan, so he gets Claude Bragdon. Who was Claude Bragdon? Well, we now have a wonderful book about Claude Bragdon by Jonathan Massey. We have had an exhibition, but in Rochester, New York, where Claude Bragdon came from, where his archives are. And a wonderful thesis by a person by the name of Malatumi at the University College London on Bragdon. He had a very simple idea that a new architecture would come into being through the study of geometry, and published a book coinciding with his lectures at the Art Institute called Projective Geometry. This is the frontispiece from that book, showing the beauties just of geometric rumination. He was a great admirer of Louis Sullivan, and that becomes rather evident in this image. It looks very Sullivan-like up there, but Sullivan never extended it to the clothing of the people within the buildings. And his idea actually had a good deal more impact than we would think. I will simplify things by simply saying that one of the most important points of Jonathan Massey's book is that this is where Buckminster Fuller got it from. Bragdon goes right into Buckminster Fuller in the 1920s here in Chicago, and the rest, in a sense, is history. This was a American side of modernism, which was not to be found in Europe. This study of geometry, and this solution of practical problems through geometry, which, interestingly enough, is extraordinarily evident in, would you believe, the Griffin's work as well, in the cast concrete structures of the Castle Crag system called Nitlock, or even in the geometry of the unbuilt Griffin House itself in Winnetka. And here we are again to the Castle Crag image. So let me skip to the next to last. Was it a spectacle? Of course it was a spectacle. But spectacle was very important. This is a drawing we're going to have in the exhibition. It appears as if it might have been from the hand of none other than Daniel Burnham. But it's what he meant you to see at the Columbian Exposition of 1893. Here's where the railroad connection to the downtown brought you in, and he shows a place for you to stand and these lines shooting out from that place. You were supposed to come in, look down the great Court of Honor across the water basin there, out to Lake Michigan, the great statue there by Daniel Chester French. In other words, this great tableau, that he imagined the Columbian Exposition as something to stand and gaze upon. Here we are looking back. In actual fact, that place to look out from got muddied when it was built. There is a great doorway there in this central building right in front of the railroad station, but it doesn't have the openness that the Burnham drawing, if it is a Burnham drawing, implies. And in a funny sense, and I shouldn't use the word funny, rather clearly, the Capitol brings that back and permits you to stand there and enjoy the spectacle of the Molonglo Valley there, not to mention to also stand on the top of Mount Ainslie, as you can today, and look back at it. That is to say, it's a spectacle in the sense that the scale upon which the Griffins are working is that of the whole landscape. And it's exactly at this time, more in Germany than in America, that the idea of combining architecture and landscape start to come together. I talked about how Hilbesheimer had actually worked for this man Billink, who in 1903, 1904 teaching at the technical university in Karlsruhe, set that as a problem for his students. Later on in 1909, we have, for example, this Berlin architect, Otto Kotz, imagining a strange architecture that can morph into absolutely amazing things. And we'll have a quotation on the wall with Kotz saying, why is it that we cannot have an architecture where you build with the mountains the way a child might play with sand? And the crisis of World War I then causes utopians, a man by the name of Bruno Taut, T-A-U-T, to imagine a utopian community getting together and building huge and wonderful iron and glass buildings on mountaintops like that, or the whole earth covered with great iron and glass structures. Bruno Taut being a very close friend, would you believe, of Ludwig Hildesheimer, who had a different kind of utopia, a grimmer type of utopia. So we must not also, when we're thinking of Canberra as a mere utopia, forget that it also is an incredible coup d'oeil, an incredible thing to look at, whether it be a capital or whether it be a utopia. But also, there's the last thing, which is it a drawing? In 1912, these drawings arrived in Canberra. A somewhat unsophisticated panel of 3 engineers and architects were asked to evaluate them. A considerably less naive Minister of the Interior named King O'Malley, who lied about the fact that he was an American all his life. He claimed to have been born in Canada. He went in his maturity to Australia, never bothered to achieve Australian citizenship because he was from Canada. And only more or less on his deathbed, but he'd call people around and say, you know, guys, I'm an American all along. King O'Malley was a wonderful, active politician. It's usually assumed that King O'Malley looked at these drawings and said, let's go with those boys. And off they went. Well, saying that is one thing, being attracted by the drawing technique of Marion Mayonnaise, and I should have shown this image further because, of course, Marion did things for herself as well. We have 2 of them in the Block Gallery, her tree portraits from Tasmania, a trip to Tasmania in 1916. Marion Mayonnaise clearly was one of the reasons why they won the competition. Now I'm showing you the silks at the Avery Architectural Library in Columbia. They haven't weathered well. The colors have changed. Here's the solid rock house, once again near New Trier High School. This is the silk at the Avery Library, but the colors have washed out terribly. It's a shame. Anyway, how did it become a capital? The story is told in Paul Reed's history, but to summarize it very, very simply, it was 1/10 executed when Griffin resigned, 1/10. It was 5% executed. The lagoon had not been dammed and created. There were little townlets scattered around the valley. After World War II, there was a very powerful prime minister, Menzies. And Menzies asked a very famous British town planner, Sir William Halford, to come to Canberra and to turn the city into a capital. And Paul Reed, a guy named Peter Harrison, and Halford got together and they said, let's do the Griffin plan. And they did. And God bless them, because they wouldn't be there if they hadn't. And they had to, here are some of the Mallee Stevenses. If they had to accommodate a much larger population, so instead of building on the hills, they created outer suburbs over on the other side of the hills. The automobile had come into being. Griffin hadn't thought about automobiles. He'd thought about streetcars. They created an automobile system, very, very sympathetically to it. During the 50s, they actually executed this updated version of the Burnham Plan. And as he was ending his prime ministership, people came to Menzies and said, We are going to dam the lagoons. We're going to create the water at the very center, and we're going to call it Lake Menzies. And Menzies, God bless him, said, no, let us call it Lake Burley Griffin. And I think by that single effort, everyone understood that this town had been designed by Walter Burley Griffin. If they hadn't done that, we probably would be celebrating Prime Minister Menzies' plan for Canberra, or Sir William Halford's plan, or Paul Reed's plan. But in that single gesture, God bless Prime Minister Menzies, all of a sudden, the artist who started the whole thing got credit, but his wife did not. And on that word, I think I will stop. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
Yeah.
Yes?
Early when you started, very beginning of the lecture, you used the word underground.
Underground. I don't